Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be venturing into the dark depths of cemeteries. I do, however, have something important to tell you though. The final story is connected to the first four, and it has been narrated previously on this channel and been used in a compilation video quite recently. However, given that all 5 stories fit together rather nicely, I thought I would leave it at the end, just so that you have the whole set, and for any listeners who might not have heard it before. So, without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I am a female in my late 20s. My parents, a charming lesbian couple, owned a funeral home and cemetery in a village on the outskirts of the Alaskan tundra. It was a small business that had been passed down from my grandmother Agatha's father, who inherited it from his father, and so on. Katie, my other mother, was terrified of the whole situation from the beginning. She was positive that someone would get possessed with us living so close to a field of corpses, in her words. Over time, exactly 8 years after they moved there, she grew to respect the land, as well as the tenants resting in peace there. I was born shortly after her change of heart, but she still limited my access to the cemetery. And while no one was ever possessed, we still had our fair share of terrifying experiences at our home and throughout the property. I went to a tiny schoolhouse every weekday from the time I could walk. Only 13 or so children lived in our town, so we were all educated in one room by a small group of teachers. Katie and her twin sister Gloria were 2 of these teachers. The 3 of us would walk to and from town every day, while Aga and her brother Cal took care of the property. It was a 20-minute trek, but on the occasional day without freezes, we got to take our bikes, and that was generally the highlight of my life. However, on this particular day in December, we had to walk. We were only at the school until about 4 o'clock that afternoon, but the sun usually set around 3:30, so we were shrouded mostly in darkness by the time we got up to the dirt road leading up to our property. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and still used my clumsiness as an excuse not to walk up the path, muddied by snow. Glory had drawn the short straw and was giving me a piggyback ride up the hill. I was resting my head against her back and staring at the cemetery that was beginning to come into view around the paper birches and spruce trees. It was a sprawling field filled with an odd assortment of mausoleums, colorful tombs of Inuit and the Russian Orthodox citizens, and I was always entranced by the graves and tried to pick out the ones that I had yet to see. We were nearly to the house when I saw a figure standing in the far right corner of the cemetery. It was hard to discern their age or gender, but I could tell from the build that it wasn't Aga or Cal. Visiting hours ended at sundown regardless of the date, so I immediately pointed the person out to Katie. Most of the finer details are recalled by my parents and older family members, due to my young age throughout most of these events, but I can still clearly remember hearing Katie mutter, "Shit," quietly under her breath. She helped me off Glory's back and ordered that I go inside to tell Cal to meet them in the field. Without hesitation, I suddenly found myself as sure-footed as a bunny on the icy ground and sprinted the last 20 or so yards up to the house. I swung the door open and went into the kitchen where I knew I'd find Aga and Cal, and told my uncle to get the trespasser. Groaning, Cal finished his cup of coffee, which was probably spiked with whiskey, and stood from the table. Angak Cal was a big guy, about 6'8", with broad shoulders and what I called Fred Flintstone fists. Basically, he could knock someone out without much effort, and he did so time and time again. He was insanely protective of his sisters and all of the other women in his life, Glory and Katie included. The entire town respected him and feared him at the same time. He was a nice home security system. Naturally, I was thrilled with this tiny bit of excitement in my normally humdrum life. When my uncle charged out the back without so much as a coat on, I turned my pleading eyes to Aga, who barely flinched at the activity. She stared back at me for only a moment, before sighing and motioning to the rack by the door. I grabbed her parka and helped her put it on as we made our way outside. Knowing that her wife was going to be none too thrilled with my presence in the cemetery, Aga picked me up when we reached the cast iron fence that surrounded the property. We could see Cal's giant silhouette approaching the tiny ones of Katie and Glory. The stranger was still a good 100 or so yards from us. "Let's hide and watch," I whispered to Aga, when I realized that Katie hadn't spotted us yet. For a moment, I thought my mother would shake her head and go to the others, but she surprised me by giving me a conspiring smile and ducked behind a mausoleum. "We can get to Grandmother's grave if we're very quiet," she told me with a glint in her eye. She loved the graveyard and had spent her childhood playing in it, while also learning about her ancestors and the people of her town. She wanted me to enjoy it as much as she did. We hurried from grave to grave, pausing only long enough to make sure the others didn't see us. Katie, Glory, and Cal were moving swiftly as well, but they were too busy eyeing the figure standing only about 20 feet from the large tomb that encased my great-grandmother, our destination. When we arrived at the tomb, Aga set me down, and we crouched behind the rocks and wood that surrounded Grandmother's altar. It was then that I began to feel nerves eat away at my gut. This was a stranger, I could tell. They were standing at the base of the mausoleum, built to honor the infants who had passed before being blessed by the tribe's shaman. This was an old, outdated site that didn't fully honor Inuit customs, though it had been redone in the 1970s, closer to the northern section of the property. No one came to this site because it would be considered disrespectful to their deceased, but it would have just been as disrespectful to tear it down. So it was just a derelict memorial that loomed on the tiny hilltop of that section of the cemetery. Tension filled the air as Cal, flanked by Katie and Glory, approached the stranger. I could hear my uncle speaking to them, likely telling them our hours and asking them if they'd like a ride back into town. He always started off nice, giving people the benefit of the doubt before going into Hulk mode. Aga, who had initially been giggling at the sight of her brother looming over the trespasser, was beginning to cling tighter to me as time went by. It took us a few minutes to realize that the person hadn't been responding to Cal, nor had they even looked his way. They continued to stare at the area just above the mausoleum. Katie and Gloria were exchanging uneasy glances at one point, and Cal told them to go back to the house. They refused and stepped closer to his side. When words failed, Cal resorted to the physical approach. He later recalled that he could tell the person was an old man, and that they were frail, and that he didn't want to hurt them. But he wasn't listening, and if he was deaf, he'd have to get his attention somehow. My uncle placed a gentle hand on the gentleman's shoulder, and immediately he felt a wave of nausea overcome him. He hunched over, clutching his abdomen, and cried out. Aga ordered me to stay put before darting off out from behind the stones and over to her brother, who waved to her and the other women to make them leave. He insisted they go inside, but they were all frozen in place. The strange man still hadn't moved, so Katie yelled at him once more. She stepped around in front of him and waved a hand in his face. You need to leave. I'd heard her command. You can't be here after dark, it's not safe. No, it's not, the stranger finally said. He lowered his eyes to meet at my mother. Are you all right, dear? He spoke so casually to her. She stood there in shock for a good moment. She looked back at Cal, who was on his knees at this point. While she was distracted, the man turned and headed towards the exit. When he was coming towards my hiding spot, I had every intention of getting up and running away, but I was frozen in place. It felt like my body was being held down by weights, and I was sinking into the earth. I whimpered and buried my face in my arms, praying to God and my great-grandmother for safety. The ice and leaves crunched in my ears, and I knew Aga realized my predicament and said something to the others, because I could hear Katie shouting at her. Finally summoning the courage, I looked up to see the man walking right by me. He didn't so much as look my way, but as he passed, he said, "Good night, Blue Eyes," in a dulcet whisper. Immediately I relaxed and climbed to my feet. I watched him practically float out of the cemetery and towards the road. Katie came and got me, telling me we had to take my uncle to the hospital. As it turns out, Cal had to go in for some emergency surgery because his appendix had ruptured. He's convinced that the old man somehow cursed him on contact. Even Aga, sweet but superstitious Aga, had her doubts about his claim. There was nothing malicious in Cal's approach to the man. Why would he have cursed him? This wasn't the last time we saw this strange man. We actually saw him 2 or 3 more times in the following weeks. He was always at the derelict infant's mausoleum, staring up at the sky. He never spoke or bothered anyone, and from that point on he always came while it was light out. I would sometimes sneak out and watch him from my grandmother's grave. He was a white man, which struck a chord with me. It was my theory that he was Katie and Gloria's real father, who had abandoned them when they were still very young. Katie quickly disproved this theory, telling me that their father died in the early 90s. But that meant nothing to me. It could still be him. The last time I saw him was in early February the following year. It was snowing heavily, and I was helping Aga and Cal go about and check to see if all the tombs and mausoleums were closed. Sometimes family members of the deceased would perform rituals on their newly departed, placing ceremonial offerings on their bodies, but they weren't always restored to their tombs to the way they were. We did our best to ensure that none of the graves would be flooded come the next thaw. When we approached grandmother's grave, I heard Aga sigh airily, but continued on. Immediately, I looked to the old mausoleum and smiled to the back of the old man. "Good morning," I called out to him. "There's no such thing, Blue Eyes." I heard him respond this over the wind. I began to laugh because it sounded like something Gloria would say after a night of drinking. But suddenly I felt a ball of sadness coil up in my stomach. I began crying and looked up at Arga with a sorrowful pout. It was the first time I had really ever felt dread, and it nearly brought me to my knees. Arga picked me up and took me inside, where I instantly felt better. The man was never seen on the property again. I was a little sad about it, but the adults were glad. They didn't like the pull that he had on us. When I was still a baby, my Aunt Dawn's friend Eddie came to work for us. He didn't have any qualifications other than being strong and willing to work around dead people, so he was hired. Eddie was a bit weird, and according to Arga, he had a super obvious crush on Dawn. Dawn, the sweetest summer child, didn't think anything of it. She insisted that he was just a shy kid who didn't know how to talk to people, let alone girls. With her being the prettiest girl in her class, she took it upon herself to befriend the older teens. She was only about 15 when this all happened, and Eddie was 17. This event does not involve any violence against my aunt. I want to make it clear. Now, a little something about the property. It is an absolute treasure trove of eclectic tombs and mausoleums, but there are also dens and caves close to the woods where nature has been left alone. While there aren't really any animals that use these dwellings, we still leave the spaces be so that they are there during blizzard season. On the morning that Eddie started, Katie found him taking a nap in one of these dens. He hadn't even been there an hour. A few hours later, he came inside and asked for a snack. Though he hadn't done much work, Katie made him a sandwich, and when he'd finished eating it, she requested that he go into the funeral parlor and help Arga with inventory. He nodded and hurried into the doors that led to the parlor. When Arga came in less than 10 minutes later, Katie asked how Eddie was doing. Arga seemed confused, and when Katie told them what she asked the kid to do, she said that he'd never come in. The two of them went looking for him, and they found him sleeping in one of the empty caskets in the showroom. Fed up and slightly concerned, my parents asked if he'd gotten enough sleep the night before, and offered him the guest room for the rest of the day, and he could finish his chores the next day if need be. Eddie apologized and declined their offer. "It's just a hangover. I'm okay now," he admitted with his blank face and monotone voice. With that, he got to work. He helped Arga with the rest of the inventory, repaired the bulldozer, and even repainted the front gate of the cemetery. He was a model employee by dinner time. Dawn made him some stew and brought it out to him. I had been a pill all afternoon, crying and screaming because of an earache, and my mothers didn't want to subject anyone outside of the family to the horror. A few minutes after she'd left, Dawn came back in to get Arga. She said she could hear Eddie screaming but couldn't find him. The two sisters went out, and sure enough, there was no peace to be found inside or outside that evening. They tracked Eddie's shouts to the cemetery. That was the easy part. The graveyard was pretty big, and sound traveled funny there. Some places echoed, in other parts, the sound was muffled. Poor my grandfather always told me that the restless spirits in the quieter places, and that sound didn't travel much, as they needed a little extra peace until they found themselves. Eddie was probably pissing off a lot of spirits that day, because he was practically shrieking. Arga and Dawn split up first, searching the dens where Katie had seen him that morning, and then spreading throughout the actual tombs. After nearly 20 minutes, Dawn called for Aga to come over to one of the covered plots near the fence. It was covered because there was to be a burial there the following day. They didn't dig too far normally, due to the ground almost being frozen, but they still had to clear 3 or 4 feet to make room for the base of the tombs. My Uncle Cal had dug the plot a few days earlier, and he was going to come over the next day to help Eddie set up the rest of the site. Eddie was lying inside the shallow hole, holding his mangled knee to his chest, and screaming Dawn was staring down at him, at a loss. She was small, and couldn't help this big guy if he wasn't fully coherent. Aga was equally stunned at first, but as soon as she saw the scratches on the kid's face, she assumed it was some sort of animal attack. Climbing into the hole next to Eddie, Aga turned him on his back so that she could fully examine him. But as soon as he was facing up, he began screaming about the sun hurting his eyes and started scratching at his face. Aga and Dawn tried to calm him down, but when they failed, Dawn ran to get Cal from the house. He was much bigger than Eddie and could easily overpower him if need be. When he arrived, he sent his sisters inside. He asked them to call the town doctor and inform him that he was bringing Eddie in immediately. They watched Cal load Eddie into the truck and sped off down the road towards town. It wasn't until earlier the next morning that they got any kind of answer as to what happened. Eddie was a babbling mess, speaking in mostly broken Inupiaq. When he finally strung together a proper sentence, he began describing a giant hairless canine beast that attacked him when his back was turned. He said that it bit into his shoulder and transformed him into a wolf. Cal, who was very superstitious, believes that Eddie was attacked by a kikron, an Inuit version of the hellhound. Only it looks like a supersized baby ferret with fangs. It has never been told that a quirkron's bite can mutate a human, but Eddie did in fact have what looked to be a pretty nasty bite on his right shoulder. The doctor said it appeared to be a dog bite, and it was super infected. Rabies weren't really an issue in our neck of the woods, but Eddie was still quarantined, and we steered clear of stray dogs for a while after the whole ordeal. Eddie never recovered mentally. Not that he was stable to begin with. He was constantly trying to tear off his own skin and bite the necks of those who tried to help. Luckily, no one was seriously injured by him. But most sadly, Eddie ultimately ended up taking his own life 2 years later. He slit his wrists with a sterling silver knife that his mother had gotten him from her shaman. They believed that it was the only way to rid him of the beast that possessed him. When I was about 16, my cousins Lena and Vincent were visiting from New Mexico. They are both a few years older than me, but we got along really well. I'm the youngest of all the grandkids on Katie's side and the only grandkid on Aga's, so I always looked forward to seeing these two. They were staying with us a few days over the summer. They were both in college by that point, and they wanted to have some time away from the heat before they went back to their rigorous schedules. Their dad, Katie's brother Max, was there as well. He was a paleontologist and was intending to do some digging in the tundra while he was there. Around the second week of their stay, Katie and Gloria went with Max to his site, leaving Aga to entertain us young'uns. She was feeling a bit under the weather, so she requested that the 3 of us go out and do some of the maintenance she had been working on in the cemetery. Weeds aren't much of an issue here, but grass, flowers, and other plants die when the weather is so inconsistent. Every June and July we would go to all of the grave sites and clean them up. I'd been relieved of my duties because my cousins were in town, but Arga didn't want it getting backed up. Plus, she'd promised to drive us into the city the next day and treat us to dinner and a movie if we helped. Vincent was surprisingly squeamish about the cemetery. He kept asking me why the tombs were so easy to open and freaking out about the possibility of something jumping out at him. It got to the point where Lena and I couldn't take it anymore and asked him to go sit on one of the concrete benches that lined the fence. As he was going over, he let out a groan and covered his nose. "What the hell is that smell?" he shouted. There was an unspoken rule in my family that we were to never speak of hell or demons within the gates of the cemetery. So I immediately shushed my cousin and asked him to say a prayer aloud to ask for forgiveness. But he ignored me and pointed at one of the tombs. "Why is that one broken?" he demanded. I went over to see what he was talking about and was startled to realize that one of our newer tombs, the one belonging to the village shaman's late mother, had a large crack down the middle. It looked like it had been sloppily broken and reassembled. The intense smell coming from it suggested the body was well into the decomposition process. For some idiotic reason, I pulled my shirt over my nose and crouched down to further inspect the grave. I shifted some of the smaller pieces of stone to the side and peered into the hole I'd made. Of course, the first thing I saw was the old woman's rotten hand. She had died 2 months before at the age of 102, and her skin had been like tissue paper, so her bones were already visible beneath the remaining tissue. The rest of the body was connected, and everything that had been buried seemed to be there. When the initial shock from seeing a deteriorated corpse wore off, I did notice something rather shocking. The body was positioned with the head towards north. In Inuit culture, only men are buried with their heads facing north. Females were buried facing the south because they got cold easily. We never would have mixed this up, and even if we had, many people would come to view the body for days before it was finally laid to rest. Someone would have said something, that she had been positioned wrong. This revelation is what truly sent me into panic mode. Someone came in and not only desecrated a grave, which is twisted no matter which culture or belief system you're from, but they also rearranged the body in a way that could affect their spirit negatively. This woman could now be suffering in the land of souls. I ran inside without a word to my cousin. Arga knew what to do about this. She used to tell me stories of grave robbers from her childhood. These were fishermen from a town over, and their goal was to steal the jewelry and pelts our dead had been buried in. When I finally woke my mother from her NyQuil coma, she pulled on her jacket and followed me outside to the vandalized grave. Vincent was standing just outside of the cemetery now, his face white as a sheet. He obviously hadn't told Lena about our discovery, because she was on the other side of the yard plucking dead flowers out of the ground. Arga yelled at her to come and take her brother inside. When Lena waltzed over to us, she noticed Vincent was shaking and taunted him in a high-pitched voice. "Ooh, little buddy, did you see a ghost?" Arga shoved him towards the house and demanded that he pray for forgiveness. She then asked Lena to call the police in the next city over. Matters such as this had to be dealt with by a higher authority than the ones our town had to offer. Surprisingly, Arga allowed me to stay behind and help her examine it. I chalked this up to her being drunk on NyQuil. She was just stunned with the state of the grave and the body inside. Her experience prior to this had been in greedy white men who wanted quality ivory and labradorite jewelry. For some reason, that was easier to accept than someone deliberately dooming the spirits of those who were laid to rest. The police came along with the shaman of the next village over. The one in our town was unable to perform a proper ceremony due to his relationship with the deceased. We have all been assured the woman's spirit is at peace now. There were no suspects as to who desecrated the grave, and it never happened again, so the police didn't really follow up with us after that. As you can imagine, my cousins refused to go into the cemetery after that. As you surely now know, I was generally restricted from going into the cemetery by myself when I was younger, up until I was about 11 or 12. That's when I was glued to my parents' sides when we walked to the property. My Uncle Cal used to be the top candidate as my chaperone when neither of my mothers were available. He's a pretty solid dude, and he's willing to knock out anyone who poses a threat to me or anyone else in my family. One morning, when I was 6 years old, my mothers needed to be at the school to discuss an upcoming festival. Cal wasn't what you would consider a natural when it came to kids. He was so nice and did his very best when he was left to care for me, but he never really mastered the art of talking or playing with me. For example, on this particular day, he decided to play hide and seek. This wasn't anything new to me. I'd played all the time with my mums and aunts, but they always knew to go over the rules very carefully before we'd play. Stay in the yard, don't go into the cemetery, don't hide in any holes or dens made by animals, and always come out of your hiding spot when the seeker yelled, "Ollie ollie oxen free." Uncle Cal didn't know about these rules, and I wasn't about to remind him. I wanted to find a new hiding spot. If I had to crouch down inside one of the chicken coops one more time, I was going to scream. Cal hated to hide, so he volunteered to seek every time for the game. This was an added bonus. When I played with my parents and their sisters, I had to be the seeker all the time. I was slow, and they were competitive, so they didn't hold back when they got a chance to tag me. "You have to count to 100, I informed my uncle, as I led him to the shed that would be my home base. "And you can't peek." He nodded along and turned to face the wall of the shed. I was running before he even began to count. I wasn't going to hide behind a gravestone or mausoleum. Even at a young age, I knew how disrespectful that would be. But there was a patch of trees in the center of the yard that were calling me. I discovered it a few weeks ago, that one of the trees, an aspen tree, had a low-hanging branch that I could climb if I got a running start. Kids climbed one similar to it in the play area at school. I had joined in with them once, but my Aunt Gloria, who taught me at school with my mum, Katie, was on playground duty that day, and she immediately made me get down. Without an adult to tell me no, and with at least 60 seconds left, I sprinted through the cemetery towards my goal. The tree that I have since named Ulei, after the Edgar Allan Poe poem, welcomed me with yellowing leaves and white branches hanging down like arms stretched out for a hug. I didn't hesitate. In fact, I picked up speed and lunged as soon as I was within reach. With what I can only call pure luck, I was able to grab onto the lowest branch and pull myself up on the first try. I was only 5 or so feet off the ground, but I felt as though I had climbed the Denali Peak. Knowing that I could still be seen in my bright blue jacket, I scrambled up a few more branches and positioned myself behind a large cluster of leaves that had yet to fall. By the time I was fully situated, Cal was done counting and had been moving about the yard for a few minutes. He checked in the usual places a 6-year-old may have hidden. Most of them were places that I had frequented in hide-and-seek of days past, and a few places he looked were ones I had never thought of, but catalogued in my brain for the next time I played. I could see him quite easily from my little perch, and I was able to laugh at him without fear of being heard, because he was nowhere near me. He was scratching his head and double-checking everywhere he'd previously looked before, and then went into the house to search. At this point I was getting sore, and leaned back against the trunk of the tree and waited for him to come out. The air was quiet, and I could hear the chirps of some birds nesting in the surrounding trees. If I hadn't been sitting on a narrow branch, sitting 20 feet above the ground, I would have allowed myself to drift off, but I stayed alert, hoping to see my uncle reappear soon. It was then that I felt a tingly feeling on the back of my neck. It wasn't unlike the sensation I got when my mums ran their finger through my hair or rubbed my back. Feeling relaxed, I glanced around and noticed just how still it was in this little oasis centered in the aunt cemetery. At this point, I was feeling rather euphoric. It wasn't until I was older that I found something that simulated a similar feeling. I wanted to find my mums. I had this overwhelming need to tell them that I loved them and give them a hug. I felt guilty for going into the cemetery and breaking their rules. I quickly began to climb out of the tree, and in the process, ended up missing a branch and fell about 8 feet to the ground. Later on, I would learn that I broke my wrist and thumb when I landed, but somehow didn't feel the pain and just had to return to my parents. In my delusional state, I decided the best route to take to get to town was through the woods behind the cemetery, probably because I was closer to the woods than I was to the road, but the forest was thick, full of traps that had been set by hunters and forgotten about. It was another place that I was told to avoid. Luckily, I didn't run into any traps that day. There was a pretty clear path that had been made by my mother, Aga, and her siblings back when they were young, so I stuck with that. That's when things got hazy. At some point, the euphoric sensation turned into one of dread. I began to feel as though someone or something was chasing me. I remember crying and calling out for Cal to come and find me, and eventually, I blacked out. When I awoke, I was lying in a pile of leaves and staring up at the night sky. Pain flaring up in my right arm, and my feet stung. Climbing to my feet, I looked around and realized I was still in the woods. It took me a moment to get my bearings, but as soon as I figured out where I was only a few feet from the path and headed in the direction of the cemetery. My jacket was gone, as were my shoes and socks. I don't know what the hell happened there. My tiny feet were freezing and stung against the rocky ground. When I emerged from the forest in the cemetery, I could see red lights flashing up by the house, and I immediately knew who they were for. For a moment, I contemplated turning back and living my life in the woods, but I soldiered on, and by the time I was halfway across the graveyard, I could hear someone shouting my name. It was my mother, Katie. She was the strict one, with an Irish temper and a hand made for spanking. When I saw her running through the cemetery gate, I immediately felt a rush of relief. I couldn't run. I was too sore, and I could only hold up my left arm, but I called out to her as hot tears steamed down my cheeks. She picked me up, hugged me close, and didn't yell at me for wandering off, nor did she scold me for not wearing coat nor shoes. She just asked me if I was all right, and told me she loved me. Even then, when adrenaline was coursing through my veins, I was relieved that she was taking pity on me. I was way too drained to get a spanking. Katie took me to the house where a hysterical Aga was waiting with her sisters and my Aunt Gloria. I didn't get to stay home though. Once they realized I had been injured out in the woods for nearly 12 hours, I was placed in the waiting ambulance and rushed to the next town for medical care. I was released the next day with a bright pink cast and ordered to stay inside for at least 72 hours. The shaman visited us the next day. He was summoned by my grandfather after I told him about what led me into the woods. My parents stayed with me as I described the ordeal to the shaman. I told him about how happy I felt and about how I longed to be with my parents so much I went into the woods that I feared more than any grave and mausoleum. After that was said and done, the shaman went out to the path of trees I had been hiding in and began to bless them and burn sage and incense. He told my mothers that I could have been influenced by his spirit, but he said that it was likely a young child had passed and missed their parents. Katie, who wasn't as superstitious as her wife, was skeptical of this explanation. She believed in spirits and all, but she didn't think they had the power to control living beings. But she didn't have a reasonable explanation as to why her 6-year-old wandered into the woods and blacked out. So they allowed the shaman to go through with his rituals and reinforce their rule that I wasn't allowed to go into the cemetery alone. Uncle Cal, who had been royally terrified after the ordeal, was the only one to yell at me. I was surprised. He was always a pretty chill guy, and he never really got onto me before. But he had been terrified that he'd lost me forever. And when he found out that it was all because I had broken a rule that I was very familiar with, he blew his top. This was one of the many experiences that occurred in my childhood. I wish I knew more about what caused it, but even my tribe's leader have no explanation. They just used it as an excuse to warn children to not wander about on hallowed land. This is from when my parents first began living together. Katie grew up in a fairly large city, just a few hours from our village. Her mother was a nurse who occasionally brought medical supplies to the more remote areas of the state and provided vaccines for those who wanted them. They met Aga and her family when they were about 9 or 10. They were all friends, and Grandma Mary would sometimes leave Katie and her twin sister Gloria there overnight while she visited other villages. When they reached their teens, Katie and Aga began secretly dating, and eventually they broke the news to their families. Grandma Mary was a devout Catholic and took it surprisingly well. Pawpaw and Ma Aga's parents were a bit unnerved by the whole thing. They had never really dealt with homosexuality within their tribe, and they were convinced that their ancestors would strike them down if they allowed the two girls to continue their courtship. When the community and council members voted on it though, they all agreed so long as Aga and her family maintained their faith and upheld the customs of their people, no harm would come to them from the union. Once they had the blessing from both women's families, they were allowed to move in together. They were barely 17 at the time, but that's how it was within our village. There was no ceremonies, they just went from living apart to living together. This represented betrothal. The house they moved into was small, and only about a half-mile away from the main house, where we eventually moved. But at the time, it was Papa and Moore's house. Katie and Aga swear that the shack was once a charming little cottage, with a beautiful red door and matching shutters. But all I know is that it's currently a condemned structure that gives me splinters just looking at it. Arga worked with her father on most weekdays. Her older brother was a fisherman and he had no interest in the family business, so my mother was next in line to inherit. She loved the cemetery and the funeral home because she felt that she enjoyed providing a place for closure to those who were going through the most challenging times in their lives. Sometimes she worked long hours, so Katie would spend most of her time in the town teaching, or at the house cleaning or cooking. At the time, she wasn't too put off with the cemetery in her backyard. It was a peaceful place, and she never gave it a second thought. One afternoon, she was outside cleaning the windows. She had music playing from the radio inside, so she didn't hear the truck approaching on the dirt path until it was right behind her. She didn't recognize that it was one of Arga's family members' vehicles, so she immediately stopped what she was doing so that she could welcome the stranger. She was a debutante, and hospitality was very important. The man who stepped out the truck was white, which wasn't odd there. There were a few families in the valley, and even some Russians. They rarely made it to this part of the property, though. The main house was where the funeral home was, and all business was performed up there. Thinking that he may have been lost, Katie waved at the gentleman, who had to have been in his late 30s to early 40s. He was handsome, with an almost rugged look to him. Overall, he seemed very approachable. The only thing that seemed off about him was his lack of jacket. He was only wearing a flannel shirt and blue jeans. It was 30 degrees out in our town in this part of the country, where it can sometimes be dark all day. This was one of those times. With no sun and a substantial amount of wind, it was foolish to go outside without some sort of coat. Katie was only out there because the windows were driving her nuts. "How can I help you?" she asked him as he meandered towards the porch. "Do you have a dog?" The guy seemed out of breath as he looked about the property, as though he were looking for something. No dog," Katie told him. The stranger pointed to the wooded area on the east side of the property. "There's a dog stuck in a trap just off the path over there. Do you know whose it might be? It's brown with a black muzzle." Immediately, Katie stepped off the porch and looked towards the trees. "I have no idea. Could you not get it out of the trap?" She was, and still is, a sucker for animals. She has a habit of bringing home strays and injured wildlife to this day. "I don't have any tools with me." The gentleman pointed to his truck. "Do you have a crowbar or even a screwdriver? I can probably take the trap apart if you don't mind keeping the thing calm while I do it." It didn't occur to Katie that it would probably have been better to get someone stronger to assist him than zeroing in on a petite woman who could barely reach the top of her windows. It also didn't occur to her that the man had driven from a different part of the property, and that he would have come from the other side of the house if he was coming from the woods. All she knew was that a dog was hurt, and that she wanted to help it. She ran into the house and dug through the chest, where they kept all the tools that Arga's brother had given them when they moved in. She found the tools he requested, as well as some flashlights, and followed him to his truck. She had not yet been jaded by a world filled with criminals and pervs, so she didn't think twice about going off with a fellow Good Samaritan. The man drove fast, and when they got close to the edge of the forest, he drove off the path to get a shortcut that most of the hunters in the area used. It dawned on Katie that the man didn't have a gum rack in the cab of his truck, and that he was hardly dressed for a hunting trip. She glanced at the floor behind her seat searching for a coat or some kind of jumper that he may have changed out of, but she didn't see anything of the sort. When the truck stopped, she asked him about his attire. She suggested that they go to her brother-in-law's cabin to get a coat, and he immediately refused. "My jacket is with the dog," he explained, motioning for her to follow him up the path. The poor thing looked cold, and I wanted him to be at least a little comfortable as he waited for me. This eased Katie's nerves. He's a nice guy, taking care of a dog. They walked up the path that Katie had only ever been on once or twice before. As kids, they explored the woods, but they never went into this area for fear of being shot. With no daylight, they would at least be safe from hunters, but there were still other elements to worry about, like bears and foxes. The man led the way, shining the flashlight over the path to make sure they were going the right way. They walked for nearly a half hour before Katie stopped and took in the surroundings. She asked if they were getting close to the dog, and the gentleman nodded. "It's near the pass up ahead. He's sort of off the path, so keep an ear out." He turned and gave her a smile that even today she calls charming in a Ted Bundy kind of way. As though he sensed her discomfort, the guy started a little dialogue with her. "I'm Aaron, by the way. I live out by the border. You from round these parts?" Confused, Katie bit back the urge to throw a "no shit" at him. He had just taken her from her house. What did he think? Was she a tourist who cleaned windows for giggles? Rather than be rude, she primly hummed an affirmative, while shining her flashlight right and left, looking for the dog. "Are you married?" Aaron went on. While Katie asked him what brought him to the conclusion, he reminded her that she'd mentioned a brother-in-law. "Is your husband not home?" "Wife, actually," Katie corrected. "She's down the road. She'll be home soon." She felt that it was important to add that, even though it wasn't true, Aga wasn't expected home for another few hours actually. But she wanted to make the guy know that she might have had people looking for her soon. Aaron was quiet for a few seconds. They'd reached a rocky incline on the trail, and he seemed to be focusing on that. Once the silence began to settle, he let out a chuckle. "That's pretty hot. 2 women in all." While grateful that he wasn't like a lot of people when they first found out about their relationship, rude and disgusted, Katie almost always found his reaction even worse. For the sake of remaining polite, she faked a laugh. "Ah, sure. So, how do you know?" He stopped walking and turned to face her. Katie really hoped that he wasn't talking about what she thought he was talking about. "How do we do what?" "You know, screw," he clarified, with a casual shrug. Disgusted, Katie stepped back. "That's none of your business." She tried to remain calm, but the man's sudden change in attitude had her on edge. "Can we please just get the dog?" Oh yeah." Aaron looked around, as though he forgot why they were there in the first place. He laughed sheepishly and shook his head. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but there's no dog. I just brought you out here for a good time." His cavalier attitude gave Katie pause. She let his words sink in for a second, figuring that she had to have misheard. But when he began to unzip his pants, she knew that she had heard right. In Katie's retelling of the event, some small details change here and there, but one thing was always constant in her response at that exact moment of realization. Shit. She didn't give him a chance before slamming her flashlight repeatedly into his head, throat, and chest. She basically hit him as many times as she could until he fell to the ground. When she knew he was unconscious, she turned on heel and ran back the way they came. She didn't know exactly where she was, but she figured that if she stayed on the path, that she would eventually find her way. And she was right. She saw the truck at the edge of the field, right at the opening of the path. She checked the vehicle, and was relieved to see that he'd left the keys in the ignition. She drove it across the field towards the main house, where she found Pawpaw, Arga, and Arga's brother Cal. The three of them were horrified when they heard her account of what had just happened, and the men immediately went into the woods to find the injured man. Meanwhile, Arga called the authorities, aka Jimmy, the town-appointed sheriff, with a collection of European muskets and 3 dogs that could tear the skin off a man's bone if ordered to. Jimmy arrived as Pawpaw and Cal were returning, with the latter pulling Aaron by the foot through the mud. He was taken to a jail, aka the concrete cell off Jimmy's house, where he remained until the police from a nearby city came to collect him and perform an official investigation. As it turns out, Aaron was a fisherman from the coast, and he visited friends in our area once or twice a year. He had tagged along with some of these friends when they were visiting Cal at the funeral home, and at some point, it was innocently mentioned that Katie was at the house, and that she was home alone, or something like that. When he found himself with some alone time, Aaron borrowed a truck and found the house and the beautiful Katie alone, as promised. They never really got an answer as to why he thought it was okay to take a woman into the woods for nefarious reasons. He was a relatively attractive guy, and he seemed normal for the most part. In the end, he got a little bit of prison time, and he was banned from our village. That was the most they could do, really, given that he actually didn't do anything to Katie. After all, he was the one who came out with most of the injuries. That's one of the rare occasions that something scary happened on our property that didn't involve the cemetery or funeral home. But it was definitely the first time one of my mothers came face to face with the true evils of the world. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories from beyond the grave, or should I say just the grave. In any case, I do hope that you enjoyed them. I'm hoping to produce some New Year's Eve stories, or New Year's stories, for tomorrow, so that's something fun to look forward to. As always, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my loyal patrons for helping me support the channel. Their contributions from as little as $1 a month really help keep things running over here, and it is, as you can expect, incredibly appreciated. If you'd like to receive some nifty perks and help me keep everything going, check the link out in the description. Thanks guys. If there's a story you'd like to share, those links can also be found in the description also. And if you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. But for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.